Okay, good afternoon. I hope I don't cough too much. Thanks again for the invitation to join you here at this conference in Hangzhou. So yes, I am talking about, you can see on the screen, what we can call the intelligent urban fabric, but I'm putting the emphasis on the smart communities. We will talk a bit about the smart citizens and about the smart city, but I place my emphasis on what I call the smart community. Something happened to the presentation. Oh, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's just this one. Something's missing on this slide. So I work with the Institute for Creative Sustainability in Berlin, which I helped to create almost 20 years ago. We work on what we call a sustainable urban development and architecture with a cultural basis, so a cultural approach to the city. We are a mix of architects, planners, geographers, sociologists, and artists. My own background, I started off to study art, and then I studied architecture, and then I studied urban design and planning, traveling between Seattle and Berlin, and I decided to stay in Berlin, Germany, about 25 years ago. So it's true I was born in the United States, but I'm a Berlin person. So what do we do with the Institute for Creative Sustainability? We focus on the idea of the smart community, and I said we approach urban development and sustainability as a cultural challenge. And we also approach housing as a very special part of the development of our cities as a cultural challenge. And how do we do this? We do a lot of networking, we do a lot of educational work, we organize events like the Experiment Days, just in the last weeks, which is one of the reasons why I'm tired. We also do a lot of online networking, so we're a part of the digital world. This is a platform that we've been managing for about 10 years now, called Co-Housing Berlin. And you can find more than 150 community projects from the Berlin area on this platform. We do publications. This goes back about 5 years, called Co-Housing Cultures, including best practices from 8 or 9 large European cities. And this book, Co-Housing Inclusive, just published in the last year, including examples from a number of European cities, including Berlin. So once again, my work and the work of my organization, it starts off with the big vision of sustainability in the city. We emphasize the creative sustainability. And when we say creative sustainability, we mean the involvement of artists and architects, but we also mean a kind of urban democracy, which means looking for ways to involve people, looking for many ways to give people chances to participate. What I'm talking about today, so ideas of community development. I keep coming back to this term of community, and urban planning for the common good. So when I talk about my smart communities, I'm locating them somewhere between what can be called the private and the public. And when I say this, I'm especially talking about the scale, so the question of going between the individual and the city, but I also mean the question of the ownership. And so when I say smart communities, I'm not emphasizing smart citizens or individuals with private ownership, but I'm also not emphasizing cities which dominate or cities where everything is owned by the public. I'm looking at something in between there. So once again, we need smart cities and we need smart citizens, but my point here is that we don't want to forget about the smart communities as a building block of what could be called a sustainable city. With this conference, and we will have this in the next hour, discussions that go back and forth between the digital world and the virtual world. My communities are mainly talking about the virtual world, meaning real communities or places. But of course there are also communities of interest, and there are online communities, and there are communities of interest. And there are overlaps between these, and I think this is part of our discussion for today. But I will be mainly talking about these communities that are specific to a place. Another way I like to describe my projects is that they are located somewhere between the DIY and the DIT. So what does that mean? We're not talking about either-or situations, we're talking about new combinations. So DIY, which has become fashionable over the last decade or more, of inviting urban citizens to do it yourself, to do things in a creative way for themselves. My point is that that's a good thing, to invite people to be creative as artists and architects and smart citizens, but that we also need to encourage and allow people to do things together. So we need to look for combinations of do it yourself and do it together. So with the question of the ownership, and I think this could be one of the possibilities for overlap between the digital worlds and the virtual communities, when we talk about the question of the ownership. So the world that we know from North America and from Europe is more and more dominated by private realities, so private ownership, a world of individuals, a world of fragmented citizens. And there's this idea of the commons, which is actually a very old idea of having shared spaces or shared resources that people in a village or in a community or in a city could use. And it's an idea that's coming back. So the idea of a commons, again, somewhere between what is private and what is public. So now it looks better. So we're talking about, again, ideas of community, and for architects and for planners, for people involved in the production of the city, or in the design or the creation of the city, we're using terms like co-production. This relates to what I'm looking at in my work, and what I will be showing you today, the idea of co-housing. It also relating to a verb which is emerging in the English language anyways, the idea of commoning. So how do we work together to create what could be called the commons, or smart communities, community spaces. So let's go to Berlin. I introduce, first of all, just a bit of the language to give you some context. Berlin has a very strong history of what can be called smart communities and cooperatives, co-housing, and other things. Some of the words used to describe them, so I show you the German words and the English words, Baugemeinschaften, and building communities, building groups. Basically, these, I won't go into the detail on all of these, but it means we have groups of people usually working with an architect together and a project developer with this idea of self-organization. So it's a very strong kind of participation where people are invited to plan and to create and then to manage their own housing project. If we look back over the last 30 or 40 years, cities like Berlin were famous for squats. So this means groups of people basically moving into abandoned buildings and occupying them. But the city also became famous for what are called self-help projects. In some cases, given support by the local government. So people that were living in older buildings got some assistance to renovate the buildings that they were living in. Also things like communes, shared flats, and other structures emerging over the recent decades. For example, this thing called the Mietshäuser Syndicate. I will be talking more about the idea of the housing cooperative. I will show you one specific project. So the housing cooperative has a very long history in Berlin, going back to the 1860s and 1870s. It makes up about 10% of the housing in Berlin, but also in Germany. If we look at Berlin, we can say there are at least 500 housing projects in the city. And if we look at Germany, there are somewhere around 5,000 of these kinds of projects. So my project, again, smart communities as they relate to housing projects. I will just show you one example now from Berlin. So these housing projects are a big part of my work. So this is research, it's publications, it's networking, it's organizing events, but it's also a big part of my life. So this is where I'm living and where I'm working for the last 5 years. The project is called the Spreefeld Berlin Housing Cooperative. This is what it looked like in the planning phase. 3 buildings, close to the river, downtown Berlin. The planning process took about 4 years, maybe even 5 years, so it's a fairly intensive process involving future residents, again with the architects and project developers. This is what it looked like a few years ago, after the buildings were finished. This is what it looks like in the courtyard. In this cooperative, we have about 150 people that are living there, and about 70 to 80 people who are working there. You can see there are some children here. There's a daycare, so about 25 children come to the community every day. But we also have large community spaces which are used for cultural events, but but also for educational events, also for meetings, for people living in the cooperative, and spaces that, these are spaces that can be used by the people that live and work there, but also they can be used by people from the neighborhood or from the city. An important part of the Spreefeld cooperative is what can be called, well, co-housing. So 35 or 40% of the Spreefeld is, there are different words for it. One of them is cluster apartments. Another one in English might be shared flats. But what it basically means is people have their private spaces, but they have also shared spaces. So this means you have something like a shared kitchen or a shared living room. People share other things like cars or washing machines. So it's also part of this idea of looking for a new kind of sustainability. And when we say sustainable, then we mean looking at this with a social interest, but also with ecological interest. So social interest means the idea of the community, giving people opportunities to share things, giving people opportunities to be directly involved in the planning, in the management, and in the making of their homes. And ecologically speaking, it means saving on space, on energy, on resources. So this is what it looked like during the construction phase. This is what it looked like after we moved in. So cooking and eating together is a very important part of the life in a community project. Whoops. I think I'm going to close it with that slide. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.